Some names are erased on purpose. Some stories are buried not because they are forgotten but because they are dangerous. William Wells Brown is one of those names. Before he became the first African American novelist. Before he wrote a book powerful enough to frighten politicians and plantation owners. Before his words were banned, attacked, and silenced. He was a secret, and secrets have a way of haunting the people who try to hide them. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden chapters of American history, the stories they never teach in school, the voices that were silenced, and the truths buried on purpose, subscribe now. Comment where you are listening from. This story belongs to all of us. Now let us go back to the beginning. The story of William Wells Brown does not begin with books or applause. It begins in fear. It begins in Kentucky in the year 1814. Lexington, Kentucky, was called the Athens of the West. It was a city of learning, beauty, and pride. White columns lined the streets. Lawyers debated liberty. Professors taught philosophy. Gentlemen spoke of freedom while sipping tea on shaded porches. But behind those elegant homes was another world. A darker one. The wealth of Lexington came from enslaved hands. Hemp fields, tobacco fields, auction blocks. Men, women, and children sold like animals. Families torn apart with a signature and a handshake. It was into this world that a boy was born. William Wells Brown entered life as property. His mother was named Elizabeth. She was enslaved from birth. Quiet, strong, watchful, she worked inside the main house of a physician named Drive. John Young. William never knew freedom. He never knew choice. From the moment he could walk, his life belonged to someone else. His father was white, a relative of Dr. Young. No one said his name out loud. In the slave-holding South, silence was survival. William looked different from the other enslaved children. His skin was lighter, his hair softer, his features closer to the men who owned him. That difference made him noticeable. And in slavery, being noticed was dangerous. Elizabeth knew this. From the time William could understand words, she taught him lessons that were never written down. Watch their faces. Listen more than you speak. Never draw attention. Never forget who has power. She taught him how to read moods instead of books. How to sense anger before it exploded. How to disappear in plain sight. These lessons were not kindness. They were armor. William learned early that he was something the white household did not want to explain. He noticed the long stares. The uncomfortable silences. The way Drive Young sometimes looked at him with something close to regret. There were whispers in the slave quarters at night. Quiet voices when the lamps were low. Talk of bloodlines. Talk of secrets. William did not understand everything. But he understood enough. He was living proof of something forbidden. By law, he was enslaved. By blood, he was connected to the men who owned him. That contradiction sat like a shadow over his childhood. Dr. Young was not the cruelest master. He fed his slaves. He did not beat them daily. But kindness does not erase ownership. William saw whippings. He saw chains. He saw families sold away forever. He saw the lie at the heart of America. Men who spoke of liberty while destroying lives. In 1816, everything changed. Dr. Young decided to move west to Missouri. New land, new money, new opportunity. For the enslaved, it meant terror. Missouri was wilderness. Dense forests, unknown roads, fewer chances to escape, no familiar faces. Elizabeth held her son tightly during the journey. Weeks of wagons, river crossings, cold nights and fear soaked into every mile. When they arrived in St. Charles County, Missouri, the land was raw and unforgiving. Trees had to be cut. Fields carved out of forest. Buildings raised from nothing. William was still a child, but childhood meant nothing here. He worked until his hands hurt. He slept on rough boards. He woke before sunrise and worked again. As he grew older, his intelligence became clear. He listened carefully. He remembered everything. He watched white men talk politics. He heard them praise Thomas Jefferson. He heard them speak of equality. And he saw how those same men treated people who looked like him. Something began to form inside William. Not anger. Not yet. Awareness. He was living inside a lie so large it shaped the nation. And that lie had cracks. In quiet moments, Elizabeth warned him again. Do not trust smiles. Do not repeat what you hear. Some truths will get you killed. William did not know it yet, but his life would become a threat to powerful people. Not because he carried weapons, but because he carried memory. What he saw, what he heard, what he would one day write. This is where the story truly begins. A boy born enslaved, marked by secrets, growing up inside a system that would eventually try to erase him. And this is only part 1. In the next part, William is sold. Not once, but again and again, and each sale pulls him closer to a truth America did not want exposed. Part 2. Some horrors do not scream. They whisper. They repeat themselves every day until suffering feels normal. William Wells Brown learned this truth as a child. By the time he was 7 years old, childhood was already gone. During planting and harvest, he worked the fields from sunup to sundown. When the crops were in, he served inside the house. He carried water. He cleaned. He stood silent while white voices spoke over his head. He was strong for his age. Dr. Young noticed. Soon, William was hired out to neighbors who needed extra hands. This was common. Slave owners made money even when they had no work of their own. A child could be rented. A life could be leased. William moved from place to place, never knowing how long he would stay. Each new household had its own rules, its own punishments, its own ways of breaking people. It was during these years that William understood what slavery truly was. Not just labor, not just chains. It was total control. He saw enslaved people who had lost hope. They moved like shadows, their eyes empty, their voices flat. They survived by becoming invisible. He saw others who still carried fire inside them. They worked slowly when no one was watching. They broke tools by accident. They sang songs that sounded harmless but carried secret meanings. And he saw what happened to those who resisted too loudly. The whip, the stocks, and the worst fate of all. Sold down the river. In the slave quarters, those words were spoken the way others might speak of death. The Deep South was a place you did not return from. A place of cotton fields and graves. Through all of this, William's mother Elizabeth remained his anchor. At night, when the world finally grew quiet, she told him stories. Stories of family members she had lost forever. Stories of people sold away with no warning. But she also gave him something dangerous. Truth. She told him slavery was wrong. That it was evil. That it was not God's will or nature's law. That the shame belonged to the men who upheld it, not to the people forced to endure it. She taught him that chains were made by human hands. And what humans made, humans could break. She shared this knowledge carefully. Walls had ears. Punishment waited for those who spoke too freely. But Elizabeth wanted her son to know who he truly was. Not property. Not an animal. A human being. By his teenage years, William had grown tall and strong. His light skin and sharp features made white people uneasy. He spoke clearly. He listened closely. And he learned to read. He kept it secret. Books were forbidden. Knowledge was dangerous. But William learned anyway. Scraps of paper. Discarded newspapers. Moments stolen in silence. In 1827, everything shattered. Without warning, Drive, Young sold him. No goodbye. No explanation. One day William was on the plantation. The next, he was gone. He was sold to Samuel Willie, a tavern keeper in St. Louis. The separation from his mother cut deeper than any whip. Elizabeth had been his shield. Now she was gone. St. Louis was louder than the plantation. Dirtier. More alive. Steamboats crowded the river. Smoke filled the sky. The docks swarmed with workers. For the first time, William saw free black people. Men and women who walked without chains. Who earned wages. Who owned their own time. Their freedom was fragile. Kidnappers lurked everywhere. But it was freedom. Samuel Willie was a cruel man. Quick to anger. Quicker with his fists. William worked in the tavern serving drinks and cleaning messes. Drunken rivermen shouted. Fights broke out. Bottles shattered. William learned to move fast. To stay invisible. But the tavern was also a window. He heard stories of the river. Of northern states. Of abolitionists. Of the Underground Railroad. The idea of escape planted itself in his mind. It terrified him. Runaways were hunted, captured, branded, killed. But the thought of living forever as property was worse. In the winter of 1829, the darkness deepened. Samuel Willie hired William out to James Walker. Walker was a slave trader. Even slave owners despised men like him. He bought people, sold them, destroyed families for profit. Walker's job was simple: buy enslaved people cheap, march them to the river, sell them in the deep south, sold down the river. William became part of the machine. He helped chain people together. Men, women, children. They walked in coffles, wrists and ankles bound, feet bleeding, bodies breaking. Those who fell were whipped. Those who collapsed were dragged. At the river, they were loaded onto filthy boats, packed together, fed just enough to stay alive. Sickness spread quickly. Some died. Their bodies were thrown into the Mississippi. William watched and remembered. In New Orleans, he saw the slave markets. Human beings on auction blocks. Stripped, inspected, teeth checked, muscles squeezed, scars examined. Women endured the worst humiliation. On one journey, Walker bought a young woman named Eliza. She was quiet, strong. Her eyes still held dignity. William spoke to her when he could. It was dangerous, but he could not stay silent. She reminded him of his mother. And in that moment, William knew something with absolute clarity. If he stayed, this would be his life forever. If he survived, he would carry these horrors inside him. And one day, he would tell the world. In the next part, William makes a decision that could cost him his life. And the river that carried so many into darkness will become his path toward freedom. Part 3. Some moments change you forever. Some faces stay with you long after they disappear. For William Wells Brown, that face belonged to a woman named Eliza. It was dangerous for him to speak to her. James Walker did not like his assistants talking to the people he called merchandise. But William could not stop himself. Eliza reminded him of his mother. She carried herself with quiet strength. Even in chains, she refused to bend. During the long journey south, Eliza told William her story in low voices. She had grown up on a tobacco plantation in Virginia. She worked inside the main house. The mistress's daughter, a girl her own age, had secretly taught her to read. It was an act that could have ended in severe punishment for both of them. But kindness sometimes risks everything. Eliza had known a kind of happiness. Friends in the quarters, shared laughter, a sense of belonging. She had fallen in love with a young man named Samuel. They planned to jump the broom. It was the only marriage enslaved people were allowed to have. Then the master died. Debts followed death. And Eliza was sold. No goodbye, no warning. She was taken in chains from Virginia. Sold in Kentucky. Sold again to Walker. Each sale carried her farther from home. Closer to a future she could not control. As Eliza spoke, tears filled her eyes but did not fall. Her dignity was painful to witness. When they reached New Orleans, William watched her sold to a planter from Mississippi. She walked away with her head held high. He never saw her again. But he never forgot her. Eliza became a symbol in William's mind. A living truth of what slavery did. How it crushed love, destroyed families, turned human beings into profit. After that journey, something inside William hardened. He could not remain part of this system. He could not keep helping destroy lives. He would escape, even if it killed him. His first attempt came in the fall of 1833. Samuel Willie hired him out to a steamboat captain traveling up the Ohio River. William worked in the engine room, shoveling coal into blazing furnaces. The work was brutal, but the destination mattered. Cincinnati, a free city, a place whispered about in the quarters. A city where black people lived without chains. William watched and waited. When the boat docked, chaos filled the air. Cargo unloaded, passengers disembarked. In the confusion, William walked away. No running, no shouting, just walking. For the first time in his life, no one stopped him. Freedom felt unreal. He walked through Cincinnati in awe. Black-owned businesses, black churches, families walking without fear. But freedom without preparation is fragile. William had no money, no shelter, no contacts. Within hours, slave catchers spotted him. They grabbed him in the street, dragged him to jail. His protests did not matter. His humanity did not matter. Samuel Willie came to retrieve his property. The punishment was waiting. Back in St. Louis, William was whipped in the yard behind the tavern. Other enslaved people were forced to watch. He was tied to a post. The whip fell again and again. He tried not to cry out. Pain tore through him. When it ended, his back was torn and bleeding. But something else had been carved into him. Resolve. They could scar his body. They could not erase what he had seen. Freedom existed. He had touched it, and he would touch it again. For the next year, William waited. He obeyed. He listened. Inside, he planned. He learned roads, rivers, safe towns. He hid food. He gathered knowledge. He thought often of his mother. If he stayed enslaved, he would never find her. Never help her. Freedom was the only path. On January 1, 1834, William made his move. The morning was bitter cold. Frost covered the ground. The city was quiet after New Year's night. Samuel Willie sent William on an errand. Instead of delivering the message, William kept walking. North, toward Illinois, toward hope. He had no coat, no money, no food, only determination. The cold was merciless. His shoes were thin. His feet went numb. He avoided roads. He drank from frozen streams. He slept in barns when he could. At night, he feared dogs, bloodhounds, the sound of pursuit. For 3 days, he walked through frozen land. Each step could be his last. But he kept moving, because behind him waited chains. And ahead of him, waited something more terrifying, freedom. In the next part, William crosses a line that cannot be undone. And the hunted becomes something else entirely. A man on the edge of a new life. Part 4. Freedom does not arrive gently. It tests you before it accepts you. For William Wells Brown, the frozen wilderness became the final judge. For 3 days and nights, he walked north without rest. The cold cut through his thin clothes like knives. His feet were swollen and bleeding. Each step sent pain up his legs. He could not stop. Stopping meant death. At night, he hid wherever he could. Abandoned barns. Stacks of hay. Once, a hollow between fallen trees. Sleep came in short, trembling bursts. Every sound jolted him awake. The crack of ice. The rustle of animals. The imagined howl of dogs. Bloodhounds haunted his thoughts. He knew how they worked. How they followed scent. How they tore men apart. Still, William moved forward. On the 4th day, his strength began to fail. His vision blurred. His body shook uncontrollably. That was when he saw the river. The Ohio. It stretched wide and dark before him. Ice floated across its surface. The current moved slowly but with terrible force. On the far side lay Illinois. Free soil. But the river was a final barrier. Cold enough to kill him. Wide enough to sweep him away. William stood at the bank for a long time. Fear whispered that this was the end. That the river would claim him. Then another voice spoke. The voice of his mother. The voice of Eliza. The voice of everyone sold and buried by the system. He stepped forward. The water stole his breath instantly. Cold seized his body. His legs went numb. He forced himself to move. Stroke after stroke. The ice cut his skin. The current dragged at him. Halfway across, his strength nearly gave out. He swallowed water. Panic rose. But panic would kill him faster than the river. He focused on one thing. The opposite shore. When his hands finally touched land, William collapsed. He lay there shaking, coughing, barely alive. But alive. He had crossed into Illinois. Freedom did not come with celebration. No trumpet sounded. No one was waiting. Only silence and cold. William dragged himself into the trees and hid until nightfall. When he finally moved again, he walked toward the nearest town. Hungry, exhausted, terrified. In Illinois, he met people who changed his life. White farmers who looked at him with suspicion. Others who looked at him with compassion. One man offered him food. Another gave him directions. Eventually, William was taken in by a Quaker family. They believed slavery was a sin. They believed helping him was a duty. They gave him food, dry clothes, a place to rest. For the first time, no one owned him. But freedom was still fragile. Slave catchers crossed state lines. The law hunted fugitives even in free states. William had to keep moving. The Quakers connected him to abolitionists. Men and women who worked in secret, who risked prison, who risked death. They helped him travel north. From safe house to safe house. From whisper to whisper. Each knock on a door could be salvation or betrayal. William learned to trust carefully. Eventually, he reached Cleveland. Then Buffalo. Across the water lay Canada. British soil. Beyond American law. The final crossing was short but terrifying. A small boat. Dark water. When William stepped onto Canadian land, something inside him finally loosened. For the first time in his life, he was legally free. No master could claim him. No law could drag him back. But freedom carried weight. He was alone, poor, unknown, and he carried memories that would never leave him. William took work wherever he could find it. He worked on ships, in homes, in stables. He educated himself. Read everything he could find. History, politics, literature. The boy who had been denied knowledge became hungry for it. But freedom did not erase the past. At night, he dreamed of chains. Of Eliza. Of his mother. He knew something with painful clarity. Surviving was not enough. If he stayed silent, slavery would win again. William began to speak. At first, only in small gatherings. Church basements. Private homes. He told people what he had seen. The coffles. The riverboats. The auction blocks. Some listeners cried. Others turned away. Not everyone wanted to know the truth. But some listened. And those listeners wanted more. William crossed into the northern United States under assumed names. He lectured in cities and towns. He stood on stages and told America what it did not want to hear. A former slave speaking clearly, calmly, with intelligence. That alone frightened people. Crowds sometimes turned violent. Eggs thrown, stones, threats. William learned that truth makes enemies. Still, he continued. He began to write. Words gave him power. Words could travel where he could not. And in those words, he would expose something even more dangerous. The lies at the heart of American freedom. The secret bloodlines. The hypocrisy of the founders. What William would write next would make him famous. And hunted. In the next part, William Wells Brown becomes a voice America tries to silence. And the book he writes will shake the nation in ways no one expected. Part 5. Some truths are too dangerous to be spoken. Some voices are too loud for the powerful to tolerate. William Wells Brown had become one of those voices. After reaching freedom in Canada, he did not settle into safety. He could have stayed, lived quietly, worked, survived. But survival alone was never enough for William. He remembered the faces of those he could not save. Eliza, the mothers and children sold down the river. The men who worked until their backs were broken. He remembered the shame of having helped Walker. The guilt of complicity, and the burning knowledge that slavery was not just a Southern problem, it was a stain on the entire nation. So William returned to the United States. He returned not as a slave, not as a timid boy, but as a man with a purpose. He walked into cities where white Americans spoke of liberty and justice while chains still bound millions. And he spoke the truth. His first lectures were small, often in private homes. Word of mouth brought a handful of listeners. But those listeners carried William's words farther than he could travel. Rumors began to spread. A former slave speaking eloquently about slavery. A man who had seen the horrors firsthand. A man who refused to be silenced. His courage drew attention, and attention drew danger. Violent mobs attacked his lectures. Eggs and rotten vegetables were thrown. Chairs were overturned. Threats shouted from the back of rooms. Some towns tried to ban him entirely. But William refused to retreat. He learned to speak softly yet firmly, to hold the audience with the power of his experience. He showed them the truth they did not want to see. The truth of families ripped apart. The truth of human beings treated as property. The truth of a nation that preached freedom while denying it to millions. William also wrote. His first works were essays and pamphlets, distributed quietly. They exposed the brutality of slave traders, the lies of plantation owners, the hypocrisy of American leaders. People were shocked, some inspired, some outraged. In 1853, William achieved what no African American had done before. He published a novel. It was called Clotel, and it told a story that America was desperate to forget. It was the first novel. written by an African American. It revealed the hidden lives of enslaved people. It explored the secret liaisons between slaveholders and enslaved women. It exposed a truth too dangerous to be printed in polite society. The children of white men were often slaves, and the men who spoke of liberty were enslaving their own flesh and blood. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, appeared in his story. Not as a distant icon, but as a man who lived with secrets that contradicted the ideals he professed. The book was groundbreaking, but it was also incendiary. It enraged slaveholders, it terrified politicians, and it drew the attention of people who wanted to erase William from history. States banned the book, libraries refused to carry it, newspapers attacked it, and for decades, his name disappeared from the conversation about American literature. But William did not stop. He continued lecturing, traveling from town to town, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He spoke of morality, of justice, of the courage to fight for what is right. Every word he spoke carried weight, because he had lived it. He had escaped. He had witnessed horror and survived. William's life became a battle between visibility and danger. Each lecture was a risk. Every printed page a target. He traveled north and south. He spoke to free black communities and white abolitionists alike. He appealed to their consciences. He demanded that they see slavery for what it was. But even those who supported him could not always protect him. Mobs often gathered outside lecture halls. Threats came by mail. Some nights, he slept in secret locations to avoid capture. William's story was more than survival. It was rebellion. It was defiance. It was proof that one man, even a former slave, could shake the nation simply by refusing to stay silent. And yet, despite all of this, the broader world tried to forget him. Schools did not teach his name. History books skipped over his achievements. Publishers treated his work as a curiosity rather than a cornerstone of American literature. The reasons were clear to William. He had exposed secrets that the powerful wanted buried. He had shown that slavery was not just a regional issue, it was a national shame. He had revealed the hypocrisy of leaders, the complicity of society, and the human cost of greed. But William kept moving forward. He knew that silence was the weapon of oppression. Speaking truth was the first step toward justice. In his later years, he became a mentor. To young abolitionists, to former slaves seeking freedom, to anyone willing to fight. And he wrote more books, essays, and memoirs. Each one a challenge to the nation's conscience. Each one a record of a life lived against impossible odds. William Wells Brown's story is one of courage, of suffering, of defiance, of hope, but it is also a story that America tried to erase. A story buried under centuries of silence. A story that only survives because he refused to be invisible. In the next part, we will see how William's words began to influence the growing abolitionist movement. How his life became intertwined with the fight for freedom in ways that no one could have predicted. And how the man who once crossed rivers in the dead of winter would come to challenge the conscience of a nation. If you want, I can immediately continue part 6 with an equally gripping hook, showing William's influence on abolitionists, his growing fame, and the escalating danger he faced. This keeps the series cinematic and YouTube ready. Do you want me to do that next? Part 6. Some voices cannot be silenced. Some truths cannot stay hidden. William Wells Brown had crossed frozen rivers. He had survived whippings, betrayals, and chains. And now, he stood before crowds of people hungry for truth. By the mid-1830s, William's reputation as a former slave who could speak eloquently about the horrors of slavery had spread. He was no longer just a runaway, he had become a messenger of truth. In Boston, he spoke to packed rooms. Men and women of all races listened in stunned silence as he described the coffles, the auction blocks, the rivers of sweat and blood that fueled American wealth. He described families torn apart, children sold like livestock, women subjected to unspeakable cruelty. Every word cut through the polite lies that white society told itself. Some listeners were moved to tears. Some left in anger. Some left convinced they could no longer ignore the truth. William's story was powerful because it was personal. He did not speak in generalities. He spoke of his mother, Elizabeth, and her quiet strength. He spoke of Eliza, the young woman sold down the river, whose dignity refused to be broken. He spoke of his own journey through fear and freezing cold, and the terrible cost of freedom. As he lectured, abolitionists began to take notice. They invited him to travel with them, to speak in cities and towns across the North. They gave him access to newspapers, pamphlets, and printing presses. William's words spread further than he could ever travel. Articles and essays appeared under his name. His memoirs and stories reached audiences who had never imagined the true horror of slavery. But his rising fame brought danger. Mobs began to follow him. Threats arrived in letters. Some towns refused to host him. Yet William refused to be intimidated. He understood something that few others did. Slavery was maintained not just by chains, but by fear. If fear could be broken, if the truth could be spoken loudly enough, slavery could be challenged. And William had found his weapon: words. In 1853, he made history. He published Clotel, the first novel written by an African American. The book told a story that many in America wanted buried. It exposed the hidden lives of enslaved people, the secret unions between slaveholders and enslaved women, and the hypocrisy of men who proclaimed liberty while enslaving their own children. Thomas Jefferson appeared in his story, not as a hero, but as a man with dark secrets. A man whose ideals of freedom had not applied to all. The book was incendiary. It was banned in several states. Libraries refused it. Newspapers attacked it. Yet despite the attempts to silence him, William's influence grew. He became a symbol of resistance. A living proof that one person's courage could challenge an entire system. William did not just speak. He taught. He mentored young abolitionists. He encouraged freed slaves to tell their stories. He showed that literacy and knowledge were tools for freedom. He also used his writing to challenge myths about African Americans. He proved that intelligence, creativity, and courage were not bound by color or circumstance. But the path was never safe. Slave catchers operated even in the North. Abolitionists risked imprisonment for helping fugitives. And William knew that speaking too loudly could make him a target. Despite the threats, he traveled relentlessly. From Boston to Philadelphia, from New York to Cincinnati, he spread his message. He spoke in churches, in lecture halls, in private homes. Everywhere he went, he challenged the conscience of America. At times, the dangers became real. Crowds threatened to turn violent. Doors were locked to keep him out. At night, he hid in safe houses. Yet William's courage inspired others. Free black communities rallied to protect him. White abolitionists helped him travel and gave him platforms to speak. Through it all, he never forgot his past. He remembered the chains. He remembered the faces of those sold down the river. He remembered the rivers, the forests, and the nights spent shivering in the cold. Those memories fueled him. They gave him purpose. They made him refuse silence. William Wells Brown became more than a man. He became a voice for the millions who could not speak. His words echoed across the nation. They challenged politicians, merchants, and citizens alike. Even as he grew older, he refused comfort. He continued lecturing, writing, and speaking truth to power. He knew that freedom was not a gift, it was a fight. Clotel was more than a novel. It was a weapon. It revealed the lies that justified slavery. It gave humanity to those society had tried to erase. William's courage changed minds. It changed communities. It helped lay the groundwork for a movement that would eventually confront the nation's darkest sins. Yet even with all his impact, history tried to forget him. His name disappeared from textbooks. His achievements were buried. For decades, few Americans knew that a former slave had written the first African American novel and challenged a nation with truth. But today, William Wells Brown's story survives. Because he refused to be invisible. Because he refused to accept injustice quietly. Because he risked everything, his life, his safety, his freedom, to speak the truth. In the next part, we will see William's work inspiring others. We will see how his writings and speeches began to influence the growing abolitionist movement. We will witness the rising tension between those fighting for freedom and those determined to protect the institution of slavery at all costs. William Wells Brown's journey was far from over. And the story of courage, resistance, and the power of truth would continue to unfold. If you want, I can immediately prepare Part 7, where William's words create national attention, controversies mount, and his role as a key abolitionist figure solidifies, keeping the horror and historical drama alive for the YouTube audience. Do you want me to do that next? Part 7. Some truths are too powerful to ignore. Some voices, once heard, cannot be silenced. By the late 1850s, William Wells Brown's name had begun to spread across the northern states. The former slave was no longer just a storyteller. He was a force that challenged the conscience of a nation. Crowds came to hear him speak. Men and women, black and white, filled halls and churches, eager to understand the horrors he had survived. They listened as he described the cruelty of slave traders, the secret lives of plantation families, and the human cost of a system built on chains. But with attention came danger. Newspapers in the South denounced him. Politicians warned communities to keep him away. Mobs occasionally gathered outside lecture halls, shouting threats. And yet William continued. He knew that the people who tried to silence him feared the truth more than they feared a whip. William's writings became even more influential. Essays and pamphlets spread far and wide. His stories revealed the hypocrisy of American leaders who preached freedom while profiting from slavery. He exposed the hidden lives of enslaved families and the brutal realities of the domestic slave trade. For the first time, many Americans could no longer ignore what had been hidden for generations. Abolitionists embraced William as a key figure. He traveled with them, speaking at rallies, meeting with activists, and mentoring young advocates. His words inspired courage and action. Free black communities rallied around him, seeing in him proof that freedom and dignity were worth fighting for. But William's work was not without personal cost. Threats became more frequent. He had to move carefully, always aware of those who might capture him or silence him permanently. Even in the North, the reach of slaveholders was long and dangerous. Despite the risks, William refused to stop. He understood that speaking the truth was not just an act of defiance, it was a moral obligation. He had seen the pain of mothers torn from children, of families sold away for profit, of young women forced into unspeakable suffering. He could not remain silent while others suffered. William's courage began to affect national conversations. People debated his stories in newspapers and private homes. Some dismissed him as exaggerating. Others were deeply disturbed, realizing that they could no longer ignore the reality of slavery. In his speeches, William often returned to his own journey. He described the frozen rivers he crossed, the nights spent shivering in the cold, the terror of slave catchers waiting at every turn. He spoke of his mother, Elizabeth, and the lessons she had taught him about resilience, courage, and hope. He told the story of Eliza, the young woman sold down the river, whose dignity refused to be broken. These stories were more than history, they were a call to action. They reminded listeners that slavery was not just a distant problem, but a moral crisis affecting the entire nation. William's novel, Clotel, continued to circulate, despite bans in many southern states. Its pages revealed the secret lives of enslaved people and exposed the hypocrisy of powerful men who claimed to uphold freedom while denying it to others. The book became a symbol of resistance. Even as he gained fame, William never forgot the people he could not save. He traveled to aid fugitives, to speak for those whose voices were silenced, and to encourage free black communities to fight for justice. Every lecture, every essay, every word he wrote was a weapon against the injustice of slavery. But not everyone welcomed his message. Mobs sometimes threatened violence. Some white communities tried to ban him from speaking. Even abolitionist allies worried for his safety. Yet William persisted. He knew that true change required courage. He had seen how silence allowed oppression to flourish. By refusing to stay silent, he became a living challenge to the system of slavery. William's influence grew. Young activists began to cite his work. Abolitionist newspapers published his essays. Free black communities saw him as a leader and mentor. His courage inspired countless others to join the fight for freedom. Through it all, William remained grounded in his purpose. He did not seek fame or wealth. He sought justice, truth, and the liberation of those still in chains. His life was a testament to the power of resilience and the courage to speak out against injustice. But the road ahead was dangerous. As the nation edged closer to civil war, tensions over slavery intensified. William's words made him a target for those determined to preserve the system. Yet he refused to retreat. Every lecture, every essay, every story was a defiance of a society built on oppression. His life had transformed from one of survival to one of purpose. From a boy chained on a Kentucky plantation to a man challenging the conscience of an entire nation. He had become more than a storyteller, he was a symbol of resistance, a living proof that courage could change the world. In the next part, we will witness William Wells Brown confront the full force of danger, and see how his writings and speeches began to influence the nation on the eve of the Civil War. We will explore the risks he faced, the lives he touched, and the legacy he was beginning to forge. William Wells Brown's journey was far from over, and his fight for justice, freedom, and truth would continue to inspire generations to come. If you want, I can continue immediately with Part 8, where William faces heightened threats, engages with national abolitionist leaders, and his writings start shaping public opinion toward the coming conflict, keeping the suspense and historical drama for YouTube audiences. Do you want me to do that next? Part 8. Some stories are too powerful to be ignored. Some voices echo long after chains are broken. By the late 1850s, William Wells Brown had become a figure of both admiration and fear. A former slave who had survived the worst of human cruelty now traveled the northern states, lecturing, writing, and exposing the secrets of slavery. Everywhere he went, his words sparked conversation and controversy. Crowds filled lecture halls, eager to hear the truths he had lived. They listened to tales of families torn apart, children sold like property, and the secret unions between enslaved women and white masters. They heard of the brutality of the domestic slave trade, of the coffles marching to New Orleans, and of women and men treated as less than human. Some applauded him, some were shocked into action, some reacted with rage. William's lectures were no longer just stories, they were warnings. He showed Americans that slavery was not confined to plantations far away. It was a moral crisis, a stain on the nation, and it demanded attention. As his influence grew, so did the dangers. Newspapers in the South attacked him as a liar and agitator. Slaveholders warned northern communities to prevent him from speaking. Mobs sometimes gathered, threatening violence if he entered their towns. But William refused to be intimidated. He knew the power of his words. He knew that silence only strengthened oppression. And he knew that speaking the truth was worth any risk. During these years, William connected with leading abolitionists. He met Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. He collaborated with activists to organize lectures, publish essays, and circulate pamphlets. He shared the stories of those still in chains, giving a human face to the suffering that many wanted to ignore. William's novel, Clotel, continued to challenge the nation. Though banned in several states, it circulated quietly, inspiring free black communities and abolitionists alike. The story exposed the hypocrisy of men who preached liberty while enslaving women and children. It revealed the hidden lives of enslaved families and the devastating impact of the domestic slave trade. Every word he wrote, every story he told, became a weapon against slavery. But William also faced moral dilemmas. He had witnessed horrors firsthand, yet he had to balance the need to shock audiences with the risk of alienating them. He had to tell the truth, but also survive. William's travels took him across New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Ohio River Valley. In Boston, he spoke to audiences who had never considered the realities of the South. In Philadelphia, he met free black communities who were organizing to help fugitives escape. In Cincinnati, he returned to the city of his first failed escape, now a hub of abolitionist activity, and shared his story of survival. Every lecture carried risk. Slave catchers were still active, even in free states. Angry mobs sometimes gathered to threaten him. Yet William persisted. He began to realize that his story could do more than expose the past, it could influence the future. By educating free black communities, by speaking to sympathetic white audiences, and by publishing his writings, he could help build a network of resistance. He could help fugitives escape, protect communities, and prepare the nation for the moral reckoning that lay ahead. At the same time, William's personal courage inspired others to speak. He encouraged freed slaves to tell their stories, to write, to teach, and to resist in small but powerful ways. He showed that literacy and knowledge were not just tools, they were acts of freedom. Despite the acclaim, William remained humble. He never forgot the chains that had bound him. He remembered his mother, Elizabeth, whose quiet strength had shaped his courage. He remembered Eliza, the young woman sold down the river, whose dignity refused to be broken. And he remembered the countless faces of those still in bondage. William's lectures began to attract national attention. Politicians debated his claims. Newspapers discussed his impact. And slowly, a broader awareness of the horrors of slavery began to emerge in the public consciousness. But with influence came enemies. Pro-slavery forces plotted to silence him. Some newspapers in the South published warnings to northern communities, urging them to prevent his lectures. At times, William had to change towns at the last minute or hide in safe houses. Yet the danger never stopped him. William understood that his fight was larger than personal safety. The moral battle against slavery required courage, strategy, and persistence. He had survived the worst the South could throw at him. He had escaped the chains that bound him as a child. Now he was free, but he carried the responsibility of speaking for those who were not. As the nation inched closer to civil war, William's voice became even more crucial. He was not just a witness, he was a guide, a historian, and an activist. His words helped shape public opinion, fueled abolitionist efforts, and inspired ordinary people to confront injustice. In the next part, we will see William Wells Brown face the full force of opposition. We will witness the backlash from powerful pro-slavery forces, the danger of his lectures, and how his words continued to challenge the nation. We will see the stakes rise, as the country moves ever closer to conflict, and William remains a relentless voice for freedom. William Wells Brown's story was no longer just a story. It was a movement, and his fight for truth, justice, and liberty would continue to echo through history. If you want, I can prepare part 9 next, where William faces life-threatening opposition, his writings ignite national debates, and the tension between freedom and slavery reaches its boiling point, keeping the suspense and drama high for the YouTube audience. Do you want me to do that next? Part 9. Some truths demand to be heard, no matter the danger. Some voices shake the foundations of power. By the early 1860s, William Wells Brown had become a figure both revered and reviled. A former slave who had escaped chains and survived horrors beyond imagining now stood as a powerful voice for freedom. Everywhere he went, his lectures drew crowds eager to hear the truths he carried. They came to learn of families torn apart, of young men and women sold like property, of mothers crushed by the loss of their children. They listened as William spoke of the hypocrisy of a nation that proclaimed liberty while enslaving millions. But with attention came threats. Pro-slavery forces grew desperate to silence him. Some newspapers in the South warned northern towns to bar him from speaking. Mobs occasionally gathered, shouting threats, waving guns, and attempting to intimidate him. Yet William refused to back down. He knew that silence would only strengthen the chains he had escaped. He had survived slavery, beatings, and betrayal. Now his words were his weapon, and he would not lay them down. In this tense climate, William's writings gained even more significance. Clotel continued to circulate despite bans in southern states. It revealed the secret lives of enslaved women and men, exposing the hypocrisy of powerful figures who preached freedom while denying it to others. His essays and speeches reached far beyond lecture halls, influencing abolitionists, journalists, and politicians. William's personal courage inspired countless others. He urged freed slaves to write, to teach, to resist in small but meaningful ways. He reminded them that knowledge was power, that literacy and awareness were acts of freedom. Yet the dangers were real. Slave catchers still patrolled the North. Pro-slavery sympathizers attempted to disrupt his lectures. William often had to change towns at the last minute or hide in safe houses. Every step he took was shadowed by the threat of violence. In 1861, with the nation on the brink of civil war, William's influence reached a peak. His lectures challenged communities to confront the moral injustice of slavery. His words inspired young men and women to join abolitionist efforts and support the Underground Railroad. His stories gave a human face to suffering that some had long tried to ignore. William also began mentoring younger activists, passing on the lessons he had learned through survival and observation. He taught them how to navigate danger, how to speak boldly without losing credibility, and how to use stories to inspire action. He emphasized that freedom was not just physical, it was also intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. Despite his growing fame, William never forgot the personal cost of his fight. He remembered his mother, Elizabeth, whose wisdom had shaped his courage. He remembered Eliza, the young woman sold down the river, whose dignity had refused to be broken. He remembered all those whose voices had been silenced by chains. William's influence began to shape public debate. Newspapers reported on his lectures, sometimes critically, sometimes with admiration. His writings provoked discussions in homes, schools, and churches. People who had once ignored the realities of slavery were now forced to confront them. But with influence came powerful enemies. Southern slaveholders and their allies saw him as a threat to the system that sustained their wealth and power. They warned that his stories incited rebellion, that he encouraged slaves to run, and that he spread dangerous ideas. William faced direct threats, yet he continued to speak and write, refusing to be silenced. Through it all, William never lost his moral clarity. He knew that freedom required courage, persistence, and strategy. He had survived the cruelty of slavery, escaped, and built a platform to fight injustice. Now he used every tool at his disposal, writing, lecturing, mentoring, to challenge the conscience of a nation. As the country descended into civil war, William's voice became even more crucial. He spoke of the moral imperative to end slavery. He described the human cost in vivid detail, making it impossible for audiences to ignore. He connected the suffering of enslaved people to the larger fight for justice, equality, and human dignity. William Wells Brown had become more than a storyteller. He was a historian, an activist, a teacher, and a symbol of courage. He carried the weight of those who could not speak for themselves. He risked life and safety to ensure that the truth was told. In the next and final part, we will see the culmination of William Wells Brown's journey. We will witness his literary achievements, his ultimate impact on the fight against slavery, and the legacy he left for generations to come. We will uncover how the story of one man's courage and voice changed the course of history. William Wells Brown's fight for freedom was far from over, but his legacy was already beginning to take shape. His words, his courage, and his unyielding spirit would echo long after the chains were broken. If you want, I can now create part 10, the final part, where William's literary and activist legacy is fully revealed, his impact on American history is celebrated, and the story concludes with a powerful, inspiring ending for YouTube audiences. Do you want me to do that next? Part 10, the final chapter. Some stories demand to be remembered. Some voices cannot be silenced, even by chains, threats, or time itself. This is the story of William Wells Brown, a man who was born into slavery, escaped its cruel grasp, and used his words to fight for freedom, not just for himself, but for millions who could not speak. By the mid-1860s, William had become a living symbol of courage and intellect. He had survived the horrors of plantations, brutal overseers, and the nightmare of the domestic slave trade. He had endured whippings, separation from his mother, and the constant threat of capture. And yet, he had turned all of it into power, power to educate, to inspire, and to awaken the conscience of a nation. His novel, Clotel, the first ever written by an African American, had quietly become a cornerstone of literature that challenged the accepted narrative of American history. Though banned in many states, it survived in the hands of those who knew the truth, that the human spirit cannot be chained, that stories can expose injustice, and that literature can ignite change. William's lectures were no longer just events, they were movements. He spoke in packed halls, in churches, in town squares, wherever people would listen. Audiences heard him describe the cruelty of slavery with a detail that could not be ignored. They saw the faces of the mothers, children, and young men whose lives were stolen. They felt the weight of the injustice, the moral rot beneath the nation's proud claims of liberty. He had become a bridge between the free and the enslaved, between hope and despair. He guided fugitives to safety, advised abolitionist networks, and mentored young African Americans to tell their own stories. William's life was a living testament to resilience, intelligence, and unyielding courage. Yet even with recognition, he faced resistance. Southern newspapers vilified him. Threats followed him north and west. Pro-slavery extremists saw him as a dangerous agitator who dared to challenge the very foundations of their society. And still, William spoke, wrote, and traveled, knowing that truth was a far greater weapon than fear. In his writings and speeches, he confronted one of the nation's most uncomfortable truths: the hypocrisy of men who claimed liberty while denying it to others. He revealed the hidden histories of enslaved families, the secret lives of mixed-race children, the brutal realities of the slave trade, and the moral contradictions that made the country's ideals hollow. But William's legacy was not only in exposing injustice, it was in showing what courage could achieve. He inspired others to take action, to speak up, and to resist oppression in whatever way they could. He made it clear that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, it was the presence of dignity, opportunity, and self-determination. By the end of his life, William Wells Brown had accomplished more than most could imagine. He had survived slavery, escaped its chains, and transformed his suffering into a lifelong mission to educate and liberate. He had written novels, essays, and plays that challenged society, exposed hypocrisy, and celebrated the resilience of the human spirit. He had traveled the country, speaking truth to power, facing threats, and never backing down. William's impact went far beyond his time. His writings influenced the abolitionist movement, inspired generations of African American writers, and contributed to the growing moral pressure that eventually led to the abolition of slavery. He proved that a single voice, forged in pain and refined by courage, could challenge the might of a nation and change its course. And yet, for decades after his death, his name was largely forgotten in mainstream American education. His contributions were buried alongside the uncomfortable truths he had revealed. But the story of William Wells Brown has survived, waiting for generations to rediscover it, to learn from it, and to honor it. Today, his story stands as a reminder that courage matters. That even in the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit can rise. That words, when wielded with truth and conviction, can be mightier than chains, whips, and fear. William Wells Brown's life teaches us that history is not only written by those in power, it is shaped by those who refuse to be silenced. It reminds us that freedom is never guaranteed, that it must be fought for, defended, and remembered. It shows us that the voices of the oppressed are essential to understanding the full story of a nation. As we close this chapter of his life, remember this: the courage of one person can illuminate the path for many. William Wells Brown risked everything to speak truth to power, and his legacy continues to inspire those who fight for justice, equality, and human dignity. This is not just a story about slavery. It is a story about resilience, courage, and the enduring power of the human spirit. It is a story about a man who refused to let oppression define him, who turned his suffering into strength, and whose voice still echoes across generations. William Wells Brown survived chains, whippings, separation, and fear. But he also survived the erasure of history, the silencing of voices, and the indifference of those who preferred comfort over truth. And in the end, he triumphed. Not through violence or revenge, but through words, knowledge, and the unwavering courage to demand freedom for all. His story is a gift. A lesson, a call to action. Never forget the power of your voice. Never underestimate the courage within you. And never allow injustice to go unchallenged. The life of William Wells Brown is proof that even the darkest past can give rise to a light that refuses to be extinguished. His journey from the plantations of Kentucky to the lecture halls of the North is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring fight for freedom. History may try to forget him, but we remember. And through remembering, we honor the legacy of a man who dared to be free, and to make others free as well.